Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm here again with David Pyne. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of National Operations for the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and he has been on this program several times, so I won't say much more. Thank you, David, for joining me again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in your show.
David, so let's talk today about Taiwan in particular, and then later also about Ukraine. Some colleagues on YouTube have been noticing a shift in the narrative when it comes to Ukraine, and one of the theories is that actually in connection with the US presidential campaign and so on, the Biden administration would like to kind of dial down what's happening, what's going on in Ukraine, especially looking at the fact that the counteroffensive has failed. At this point, it's just utterly obvious after 3.5 months that this one's gone. So there's also the idea that maybe Taiwan and China will become way more important, and that actually a shift is happening. Do you interpret it that way? And what does the ongoing US presidential debate, how does that impact the discussion about war and peace in the United States?
Well, I mean, as far as what what the Biden administration is trying to do and how to frame it, it does seem like there may have been some administration leaks about the war to try to change the narrative, because we do have a very kind of state compliant media. Mainstream media is kind of gets its talking points from the Biden administration and rarely deviates from it, particularly on big issues such as climate change and of course, the war in Ukraine being the big focus at this point. I can't really speak to that with any certainty in terms of how they're trying to frame it. You really can't spin it, as you said. You really can't spin the war in Ukraine, the counteroffensive, as a victory for Ukraine. Ukraine has suffered immensely, as we can discuss later, and is I would assess the biggest loser in the war. And I think China is the biggest winner of the war in Ukraine. Yeah, in response to your question, the situation in Taiwan, this is a crisis that has been building over many years. Communist China, of course, has been wanting to reunite with Taiwan, either peacefully or by force, for over 75 years, I think. And it's something that's I feel like it's a tinderbox. It's a flashpoint. It's kind of like Danzig in 1939. It's going to happen. I don't have any doubt that this is going to escalate to war unless we can find some kind of peaceful compromise agreement. It's unclear to me, to be honest, whether President Xi Jinping would even accept a peaceful compromise agreement that falls short of his objectives for a full union. However, what I propose in my latest piece on Taiwan is perhaps an EU solution, where it wouldn't be a full union; it would be a confederation based on kind of the EU model, in which there would be some kind of supranational institutions, perhaps what I would call the Chinese Union instead of the European Union, with its own Chinese Union president, presumably Xi Jinping. Maybe a CU Congress, a CU Council. Obviously, to a large extent, Communist China being so much huger, so much larger than Taiwan, certainly would be represented in those institutions, but at the same time would have very limited powers. Would kind of set a joint national security policy and a joint foreign policy. Whereas, along the lines of what Deng Xiaoping proposed way back in the 80s, Taiwan could be still have its own armed forces. Of course, he envisioned them being part of China formally. That's something I'd like to see avoided if possible, because we know with the Hong Kong model, it's just a matter of time, I think, before China fully assimilates any country or any entity such as Hong Kong and Macau, and kind of uses counterterrorism as an excuse to try to pass kind of the national security law we saw in Hong Kong. So that's why I proposed this middle ground. I'm really amazed, actually, that there's no one else that has proposed any kind of compromise with China. And it's really, I think, kind of it's almost like an unspeakable thing. It's like appeasement. It's like the idea that we would compromise with China over Taiwan. It's kind of something that no one really wants to get into. And so I'm known for kind of bold compromise type solutions that uh, might kind of blackball me in terms of mainstream media. But I just out of an interest to secure world peace and prevent World War III, that's kind of been my focus.
Well, it's very interesting because these ideas for a Chinese federation, confederation, a Chinese union, the way you put it, those ideas have been around there, but they're not popular in the United States. They come from Taiwan itself. The former vice president Lu Xulien, she proposed a concept called a Zhonghua Union or Zhonghua Federation, and Zhonghua being, of course, the Chinese word for Chinese in the sense of Chinese food or Chinese ethnicity, not in the sense of China, but the thing that even ethnic Chinese in the US or in Singapore and the Philippines would agree we are part of that form of being Chinese, but we are not part of China. Of course, we're not nationals of the Chinese, of the People's Republic of China. But in the United States, this doesn't happen often, and we've discussed this before. You're a realist, I'm a realist. We try to think of ways to actually achieve a possible outcome based upon political realities, right? So the question to me is, of course, in this constellation, just as with the constellation in Ukraine, we know that it's not just the two countries in question. So in this case, the People's Republic of China in Beijing and the Republic of China, Taiwan, of course. But we know that the United States also has a very heavy role to play because it is the security guarantor of Taiwan. It was the United States that kind of put its aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait back in the 50s, stopping the two sides from fighting. It was the US who intervened several times in order to keep fighting from happening. But we've seen over the last 20 years how this approach has changed. And any kind of agreement between Taipei and Beijing would necessitate somehow also a nodding off from the United States. So my question to you, as an American and also somebody who's involved in the presidential campaign of Vivek Ramaswamy and so on, what do you think would the United States be willing to kind of contemplate as a non-violent end to the conflict that would not be 100% independence of Taiwan?
Well, I mean, first, I want to clarify that the U.S. has no current security guarantee over Taiwan. It has not since 1979, perhaps the year earlier, 1978. President Jimmy Carter, of course, decided to bring an end to that. We did have a security agreement, mutual security pact with Taiwan. But that's been gone for 44 years. And President Biden, unfortunately and dangerously, I think he makes frequent reference to the fact that we're obligated to defend Taiwan militarily, and that's something that's a Chinese red line. It's a nuclear red line, essentially. That if we were to actually do that, it would likely almost invariably result in a nuclear conflict with China. And so that's something we really need to avoid. But you're absolutely right. So the U.S., despite not having any formal guarantee for Taiwan, has been this vague strategic ambiguity that we've had where we won't say for sure whether we defend Taiwan, but in some ways it seems implied. And so they kind of have relied on that, and they've not spent a lot on defense. Their defense preparedness has been pretty low. They've spent 2% or less of their GDP on defense, kind of relying and assuming that the status quo will be maintained. And the status quo is actually, it served Taiwan quite well in terms of the strategic ambiguity. It hasn't been too provocative for China to make them want to go to war, immediately, and it's preserved Taiwanese independence. And so, unfortunately, that is proven unsatisfactory for Xi Jinping. My sources say he's set a goal of 2025 to reunify with Taiwan, if by military action if necessary. And so, President Nixon wisely stated that it's important that we accommodate Russia and China in terms of their vital interests to avoid potential world war or nuclear war. And so that's kind of the spirit, kind of the rationale that I had in trying to formulate this solution. Now, obviously, any kind of confederation with the PRC, between the PRC and Taiwan, would be not a desirable solution by any means. It could be viewed as a stepping stone, for China to take over Taiwan at a later date. But I really do believe that that would be unlikely to happen. For some time. It could be 20 years. But my main focus is to avoid a world war which could cost 1 billion lives if it were to lead to a full scale nuclear exchange, while at the same time trying to preserve Taiwan's autonomy and self rule, as if not a separate entity, in terms of that they would be able to preserve their freedoms, both political, religious, and economic, and do so backstopped by maintaining their own military forces.
Yeah, and just let's be clear. I mean, we are talking about an island, less than half the size of Switzerland, and with 24 million people on it. That's a mind-boggling number of people on a very, very small space. So anything short of a very, very quick Chinese victory would be an absolute humanitarian slaughter. Like, in Ukraine, people at least can run the other way and go to Europe. In Taiwan, that there's the water, right? So this would be an absolute horrible humanitarian catastrophe that needs to be prevented at all costs. The question is, what can work? Especially because I fear and I feel that in the West, the complexity of this conflict is not appreciated enough. I mean, even the fact that the island of Taiwan, the government of the island of Taiwan, still officially calls itself Republic of China. This is something that is constantly left out of the discourse in the West because it's inconvenient with the narrative, because it would require to explain that the government of Taiwan is actually the government that fled from mainland China, and that in the past the conflict was about who is China, right? That's right. As long as Chiang Kai-shek was around, the question was who is China and who has the legitimate right over claiming to be China. I mean, the Taiwan, the government there in Taipei was occupying the seat in the Security Council of China, right? And only once they were kicked out and communist China was let in, that changed. But by now, the conflict is about, is Taiwan independent or not? Now, in your proposal, you're trying to lay out a middle ground in which Taiwan would still have de facto its own independent government and legal system, insulated from the Chinese mainland system, because the biggest problem that we've learned through Hong Kong is that if you actually give China political sway over a territory that's connected to it, but different, that there was the one country, two systems framework, at some point they will just breach the legal bounds and then basically switch off the independence of these territories. And Taiwan would have to expect exactly the same, as you correctly say. It would be irrational to think that China would act in a different way. So how do you think that under a different political framework you could still maintain Taiwanese de facto independence?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the only way to do that would be to retain Taiwanese control over its armed forces. Now, its armed forces are vastly outnumbered and overmatched by the PRCs, the PLA military. Um, but you know, what they would set, what they'd have to give up, or kind of cede most of the influence would be again on foreign policy. Kind of a joint foreign policy, joint defense policy. There might be a joint air defense system, but no permanent Chinese PRC military presence on the island. Um, so yeah, it really would be a compromise solution. In answer to your previous question, would that be something that would be acceptable in U.S. political circles? I don't think it would be, unfortunately. I think there's certainly perhaps a Donald Trump or Vivek Ramaswamy, they might be more open to that, although they would come under tremendous political pressure as president to kind of clamp down on that. But as I see it, there's if we want to avoid a conflict, there's only two possible ways to do it. One is the way I proposed. The other way is simply strategic clarity that we will not defend Taiwan, and then Taiwan will be forced to negotiate a peaceful solution. But without U.S. mediation, the solution would likely be a Hong Kong, full union situation, where they probably would not have any of their control over their military. It would be merely assimilated into the PLA. So that's why I've advocated this solution as something. The U.S. has tremendous diplomatic clout, and I think China would accept this solution. I think they would view it as a step towards kind of a full union, but just a few cosmetic things, like calling it the Chinese Union, um, replacing all international maps showing them as the same country called the Chinese Union, having a joint flag with that has the Red Star. The Red Star flag is kind of a joint flag on a Chinese Union flag that would also have Taiwanese symbols. And then, of course, having Xi Jinping as the president of this Chinese Confederation. Um, I think a lot of those things, could go a long way in terms of, I think it would greatly increase Chinese prestige, while at the same time, as you said, uh, preserving, if not de facto independence, then at least their freedoms, political, economic, and religious freedoms, and again backed up by control of their own armed forces.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is we do have a precedent to build something like that, and that's actually the union between Russia and Belarus. They are currently in a so-called union state, but that doesn't mean that Belarus is not its own actor. Actually, Belarus is way more independent than Taiwan. So in a sense, proposing a Russian-Belarusian union state model would actually be quite flattering to Taiwan too. But there are these moments. Now, one of the questions I had in the past is what do you do with Taiwan as a strategic outpost? And wait, I need to show you something. So there was a activity in Taiwan by Lu Xulian, so this former vice president of Taiwan, and she even held two conferences. And let me show you this. So this is a nail clipper on my keys, and it has this symbol on here. It says "Peace, Neutrality, the Dream of Taiwan." Lu Xulian was for a couple of years after her vice presidency advocating for neutralizing Taiwan, not in the sense of making it a neutral country, but make it a neutral island, because neutrality is not the same as independence, and it might actually solve this security conundrum, saying like, okay, we are part of a larger confederation, but Taiwan is just off the table for PLA forces and for US forces. So it's kind of no man's land, but everybody can go around it, etc. But we are not a forward position for the Chinese, nor are we an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. You told me in an email exchange that you don't believe that that could fly with either China or the US.
Well, I mean, I think again with the right U.S. leaders, I think that could fly, and I think they would, someone like Trump would be more amenable, or Vivek Ramaswamy potentially could find that as a more amenable long-term solution than an actual formal confederation. But I do think that would be. I mean, the Chinese have literally they've clearly stated that neutrality for Taiwan would not be acceptable to them because it implies that they're a separate political entity able to chart a separate course from China. So essentially, any long-term solution, I think, would have to minimally concede that Taiwan is part of the Chinese sphere of influence and that they have, to one extent or another, a dominant say in its foreign policy and perhaps defense policy as well. But you're right. I mean, the absolute, the first step, I think the first step to ensure that we avoid war over Taiwan could be this neutrality proposition. It's, I lay out a number of kind of preliminary confidence building steps that would be short of a confederation that we could actually stop there where they proclaim neutrality. We clearly stated to Beijing that we're going to stop our Taiwanese naval sorties, Taiwanese Straits naval sorties, which are very provocative and really accomplish nothing at all. I mean, all they don't serve to increase U.S. or Taiwanese security. And in fact, I would argue that they could provoke a war. And in fact, if you read, I think the book name is 2034 by Admiral Stavros. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he's a former NATO Supreme Commander. He actually, in his book, the war starts with the Chinese a cyber attack on a couple of like U.S. Navy destroyers or frigates, that are transiting the Taiwanese Straits. So that's how the war starts, a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. So even neoconservative or liberal internationalists concede that that is a potential, provocation that could lead to war. What I'm very concerned about, here in the national security circles that I run in here in the U.S. is they have a number of webinars. They're typically war games, for example, over Taiwan, and they rig the game so that you can't use neither side can use nuclear weapons. That's completely unrealistic. You can't put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. It's not, we're not going to refight the Battle of Leyte Gulf, no matter how much the Robert O'Briens and other neoconservatives of the world might want to do that. And so there's a complete disconnect, a very dangerous disconnect between the prevalent U.S. foreign policy elite and the reality of what a war with China would look like. And it would be a global conflict. It would probably escalate to the cyber and space level on the first day of the war. It would probably escalate to EMP or nuclear within a few weeks. And, it could destroy the U.S. and its allies. I think Japan would be one of the first countries to be attacked. Obviously, with U.S. military bases, there's no possible way that Japan would not be attacked in the event of a Taiwan war. Potentially the Philippines bases, Australia, South Korea as well. So the way that we guarantee the security and safety of not only U.S. citizens, but those of our allies as well, our treaty allies I'm talking about, would be to reach some kind of compromise solution, or else again declare strategic clarity and clearly state that we will not defend Taiwan militarily. That alone would save us from conflict and would stave off a Chinese invasion, because no Taiwanese leader would, with that clarity, no Taiwanese leader would refuse to negotiate with Beijing as they're doing right now.
I agree with you. Just to be clear, also for Japan, war in and about Taiwan would be an absolute worst case scenario because of the islands in Okinawa and so on, and Japan does feel very vulnerable. This is something that also the Japanese try to prevent at all costs. For the Taiwanese, of course, even more so. It's this super existential question. But among all of my Taiwanese friends that I have, they agree that being incorporated into China is a bad outcome, but fighting a war with China would be an even worse outcome. So rather incorporation without fighting than actually having a war, because it's just would be so catastrophical. Now the question to me is, why is it that there seems to be a bipartisan consensus in the United States that the war with China is not a question of if but a question of when? I find this extremely troublesome when I hear these kind of statements, and also the kind of getting ready. Even Tucker Carlson, who is very much against the war in Ukraine and rightfully and justly puts a good chunk of the blame on US policy, even he is very much saying that because he says we have to get ready for the war with China. Is there a way, in your view, to de-escalate this war rhetoric inside the United States?
Well, I mean, my view, I'm a lifelong anti-communist, and I was a consummate Cold Warrior in my 20s. I was in the military when the Cold War came down as a soon to be commissioned officer in the Army. So I don't believe that China can ever be a friend of the U.S. I don't believe that China can ever be a strategic partner of the U.S. I do believe Russia, as a non-communist country, can be a strategic partner and a friend and an ally for peace. Not a military ally, but someone that a country that we can work with for peaceful outcomes. Because I don't believe they have any aggressive intentions. China, has always, communist China has always believed that Taiwan is part of China, and that is their number one geostrategic objective. It's not to take over the world economically. It's actually to end this idea of, like you said, a competitor in Taiwan calling themselves the Republic of China that really has been, at least historically, was had a claim to control of the mainland. And that's just not, it's never been acceptable to the CCP leadership, and it's certainly not acceptable to Xi Jinping, who's considered a hardliner even in Chinese communist circles. So, I think the sooner we wake up to the fact that we have to look for a peaceful solution, the better. Just rereading history. I'm a consummate World War II historian. And Nazi Germany, as evil and horrific as Hitler was, and he became, of course, with the evil genocide and mass murder of the Jews and the Holocaust, he did not want war with Poland. He did not want war with the UK and France. He wanted Danzig and a railroad corridor between Danzig and the rest of Germany, as the Versailles Treaty had broken it in half. But the Poles simply refused to talk. So what I'm saying is, we need to have discussions. We don't need to agree to everything that China is saying. But what I'm saying is, if there had been negotiations, there could have been a successful outcome that could have averted World War II. Wouldn't have averted war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, because that was Hitler's primary objective. But in this case, if we just had the Taiwanese speaking to China about some kind of compromise, agreement that would be mediated by the U.S., even if it took years, it took a few years, but we were able to come up with kind of a general timeline that's a near-term timeline, I think China would hold off. It's the very fact that Taiwan has refused to even discuss any form of confederation or anything regarding to reunification, and the U.S. has also refused to discuss. It's the failure of diplomacy that will lead us into a war within the next couple of years, based on my assessment.
Well, I mean, one thing is that we know that China is willing to discuss, right? We've had a meeting between Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeong, the previous president, who was president of the Kuomintang government. I think it was in 2014 or 15 when that meeting took place in Singapore between the leader of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, right? And they were actually shaking hands. So we know that there's possibilities. Right now, we've got another party in power, and Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, it looks as if though in next year's, in January, Taiwan is going to have elections. So she cannot stand for election because she had her 2 terms. But it looks as if though her current prime minister might actually become the next president. So no change in party, and this party is a pro-independence party. But on the other hand, we don't know how that election will come out. So January is actually a very important moment then to watch for Taiwanese internal politics. But I just would like to challenge you on one thing that you said about the communists, because of recent events. Why is it that there's no cooperation possible with communist China, but we've now seen that cooperation with communist Vietnam is no problem whatsoever? Handshakes, Biden in Hanoi. And this is even more surprising because, 50 years ago, there was a huge, huge war, very horrible, with like millions of dead Vietnamese. And it's that Vietnam, not South Vietnam, but North Vietnam, that the United States is now elevating its security relationship with. So do you think it is really the communist factor that makes an accommodation impossible, or is it more the great power factor that will stand in the way?
I think it's definitely the aggressive nature of the Beijing regime. You're absolutely right. I mean, we have a history of allying with and cooperating with communist regimes that we don't view as opposing our national interests. Or, for example, Nixon's trip to China. I mean, communist China was always viewed as the quote unquote bad communists, or the ones that were more, pushing immediate war or revolution versus the Soviet Union, which was more of a satisfied power. They had a huge amount of a huge empire, and they were a little bit more cautious about risking it, with some kind of, World War III scenario trying to take over Western Europe, whereas, China was kind of pushing a near term, war with the U.S. So no, I think if we, and that's where spheres of influence can come in. I think it's in the U.S. interest to negotiate some kind of sphere of influence agreement with China over the South China Sea. I think their 11-dash line is too. I don't think we should accept that, but we could. I would say that we could accept Chinese control of the Paracel Islands, perhaps the western half of the Spratly Islands. I don't think the U.S. should ever agree to allow Chinese dominance or control of the seas up until like 20 miles away from the Philippines, which is a U.S. treaty ally. But I think that's where we can compromise. These are islands, that are and like reefs and stuff that are essentially almost uninhabited. So that I think is of course they're strategic. There's a lot of resources, and they get close to this closer to the Straits of Malacca and whatnot, and they become I guess more of a threat to the nations that border on the South China Sea, including communist Vietnam. But you're absolutely right. If we can seek out communist Vietnam as an ally, essentially, almost a de facto ally, and try to align with them, then I think there's should be less reluctance to seek out peaceful coexistence with China, because we're nuclear superpowers. And I believe, based on my assessment, they have a nuclear arsenal that's as large or even larger than America's. I know that's not the prevalent view. Russia, of course, has even more, and they're treaty allies, and we need to pry that alliance apart. Now, I read an article, I think it was this morning, in the National Interest, that talked about how we could pry the alliance apart by aligning more with China. cooperating more with China. I think it's the exact opposite. But I think we should be aligning more with Russia, and then that would preclude that their perceived need to be a close military ally of China. But regardless, we share the same world. We're both, they're a rising nuclear superpower. We're kind of a status quo power that might be a little bit, receding, and we need to recognize the fact that we simply cannot allow a nuclear war over a nation a little bit larger than Moldova. I mean, this is a very tiny island. It's very strategic, but the U.S. has no security agreement with Taiwan. It's not a kind of a NATO member. It's not a Japan or a Philippines or a South Korea, and we just need to have a more realistic view of what's possible. You and I believe are both foreign policy realists. Realism is just like politics. It's about the art of the possible. What we can actually achieve. We see the world as it really is, and that includes a willingness to accept some unpleasant realities. And unfortunately, the U.S. is currently controlled by a foreign policy establishment which is not willing to see, to view the world as it really is. But they like to believe that the U.S. Can still bully itself around, whether it's in the Taiwan Straits or in Ukraine, and exert I refer to as overlapping spheres of influence that infringe on the vital interests of our two nuclear superpower adversaries. So that's really the key that we need to avoid is we need to not infringe on their vital interests
So
any more
last
than we wouldn't allow that them to do that to us if they were to occupy Mexico.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's the difference between us and these people. I mean, these neocon people who still pretend that it's all about democracy versus autocracy, which is absolutely dumb. We don't need to repeat why that is stupid. It's just dumb. It's not what it's about. This is a great power rivalry, pure and simple, and accepting that there are spheres of interest, spheres of influence, whatever you want to call it. It's just a necessity of life. But last question about exactly that point: these neocons in the US, the people in the driving seats, the Blinkens and the Newlands and the Boltons, unfortunately, and the Pompeos. This group is large. Now, what we've seen with Russia is that they have, and with Ukraine, that they have fantastic ideas of how weak the enemy is and what you can do with him. We've read all of these articles, right, that say, oh, the end game has to be to break up Russia into 15 successor states, right, make them very small, and then make Moscowites pay for the war, blah, blah, blah. So the end game with Russia for these lunatics was to break, the end game for Russia for these lunatics was to break Russia up. Now, what would be the end game? Because I've never read that. What would be the end game for the neocons in China? Because fighting a war for defending Taiwan and even being willing maybe to go all the way to the nuclear level just to not lose Taiwan is a dumb proposal. It's about as dumb as the idea of the Japanese in the Second World War to fight a war with the US just in order to kind of have come to an agreement to divide the Pacific, right? That was the best case scenario for the Japanese. That was a dumb idea to make a war, but we know that people do dumb things when they believe that, it's not that difficult. Now, what's the neocon endgame with China? Have you ever heard an endgame? Has that ever come to you?
Yes, I have, and actually, I'm part of an organization. I won't say what that has that very view. So the end game for China, for the neoconservatives, is regime change. It's regime
Yeah.
change with the U.S. essentially helping a non-existent Chinese resistance movement to overthrow the Communist Chinese Party and liberate China for I guess the forces of democracy. And that's really what the end game is.
But
They want to overthrow the CCP.
but
The end game is exactly, they believe that you know I actually think they believe that they can do another Soviet Union collapse. That's essentially what they want to do. They don't want to divide China into multiple pieces, but they want to overthrow communism in China just as occurred voluntarily on the part of Gorbachev and the Soviet Politburo at the fall of the Soviet Union. That's the end game. They see the fall of the CCP ending the Cold War with China.
People are so dumb. And David, because like I'm not laughing because there's no resistance movement to speak of in China. That's one thing. I'm laughing because even if you do that, you're going to have exactly the same issue, because if China remains the way it is, it's always going to be a great power competitor because of the sheer size it has and of the army it has. And I mean, Russia is not the Soviet Union anymore. Russia is actually, at least on paper, a democratic state, and Putin is democratically elected, and he actually does have the support of a large part of the Russian population. If you look at the policies of Chiang Kai-shek, this guy was as much a dictator and a horrible beast the way that Mao Zedong was. We would have exactly the same problem in mainland China, even if he had remained in power. That's just, it's great power politics. It's not the regime type. So this idea of the neocons is just crazy.
Well, I do agree with on one level. I think obviously with the Republic of China on Taiwan, you saw a mellowing. The martial law ended in 1975. Democratic elections soon followed. I think in the 80s, and it's been democratic ever since. So I do think if it were possible, and I don't believe it is, for the CCP to be overthrown, I think whatever form of government replaced it, unless it was, of course, hardline, Chinese generals, PLA generals, would be less aggressive and would be more willing to work with the U.S. productively. Certainly, there would still be the economic dominance. I think they'd want to keep pursuing that, but in terms of actual military confrontation, I don't think we'd see that. And I don't think they'd even want to, assuming it was a different regime type from Taiwan, I don't think they would be willing to resolve the Taiwan issue by force. So I do think there is some sense, there's definitely a logic that if we were to replace the CCP, it would be a much more peaceful oriented regime. It would still be the great power, be the economic, they still try to exert economic control. I think that's the CCP's main objective. I don't think they want direct war with the U.S. I think they're willing to go to direct war with the U.S. over Taiwan, but if we can resolve the Taiwan issue, I think we can avoid a great power war with China. They'll continue to try to use the BRI, which now includes, I think, over 150 countries, 155 countries, about 80% of the world's countries thus far. But that's something we can work with. I think we can, I want to try to fight that economically. I think we should have a trade bloc against Chinese dominance, economic dominance. But the fact is, we can live in a world. We exist in a world today with Chinese economic dominance. We can live peacefully without a great power war, maintain the great power peace, avoid a nuclear war in a world with Chinese economic dominance. But we just have this flashpoint. I view it as almost a ticking time bomb, which if both sides, and I'm blaming both sides in this case, I stand with the people of Taiwan. I've always loved Taiwan. I think we owe them a great moral obligation to defend them to the extent that's possible without a nuclear war. But both sides need to give, and that's what you and I are about. We're about, whether it's neutrality or some kind of compromise diplomatic solution. That's the only way, short of what I said was strategic clarity and saying we won't defend Taiwan militarily. I think that's the only way we avoid war, either near term or medium term.
Yeah, and there needs to be some sort of compromise. The question to me is, because one thing I can imagine is a compromise, an unspoken one. The amazing thing is that Taiwan has been peaceful and stable for the last 65 years, ever when the bombing stopped, right? And this has been peaceful not because there was an agreement, but because, or a signed agreement, but because there was an implicit agreement between the two of how to structure their relations. And that's why Taiwan de facto is doing fine. De jure, it's in a huge gray zone, right? But it works. So any form of compromise, signed and ratified, or implicit but accepted would work. But there needs to be a mindset that this is what we want. And what I'm afraid of is that we're running out of that agreement, and all sides are hardening toward, okay, let's settle this by force. I hope we don't go there.
That's how world wars start. And we saw, peaceful options, diplomatic compromises were available for, the great power protagonists of both world wars. In the case of World War I, if Austria-Hungary had simply accepted the stop in Belgrade option that Britain offered, I think, Russia wouldn't have liked it, but they would have accepted it. But instead, Germany felt like it had to give a blank check to Austria because it was his only ally. So and we've already talked about the situation, how World War II could have potentially been avoided as well. So you're absolutely right. We can't allow our position to harden to the extent that we forego the diplomatic negotiation process. That's how we got the war in Ukraine. Putin was absolutely willing. He actually drafted a mutual security treatment, essentially a comprehensive peace agreement with the West to resolve all of our major disputes in one agreement. And
December 2021.
That's right. And January 25th, 2022, the Biden administration rejected it, in its entirety. It'd be one thing if they had said, we could accept these, 5 of the 10 points. Russia would have, Putin would have been like, fine, we've got a deal, and no invasion necessary.
Yeah,
And
we negotiate. This was not an end product. This was a beginning.
Exactly.
This was a starting point. It's like, this is our position, show us yours. But
right.
Biden said, no, we are not negotiating. Russia, sit down, shut up, and you better know your place. And
yeah, and that's what the war in Ukraine is all about. It's about demonstrating continued U.S. primacy. The idea that we're, again, the biggest, as Colin Powell stated, former Secretary of State of the United States, we're the biggest bully in the block, and we need to teach other countries a lesson if they try to do what we've done, which is invade other countries unprovoked and illegally.
And I said this before, but I'm pretty sure at some point somebody will ask Tony Blinken, do you think 500,000 Ukrainian dead soldiers was worth it? I'm pretty sure he will answer, yes, I think it was worth it, in Madeleine Albright style, right? That's because that's right. The thinking of these people. Anyhow, it's good talking to you. It's good to know that there's like realists in the United States, sane people, and peace-oriented, realistically peace-oriented. So David Pyne, thank you very much for today.
Thanks so much, Pascal. Have a great night.